So we begin discussing the central nervous system in chapter 12 by looking at the spinal cord and its spinal nerves. In the next chapter, we look at the brain and the cranial nerves. So let's begin, like we normally do, with a list of topics. The first thing is structure. So we're going to take a look at the spinal cord a few different ways, kind of looking at it longitudinally as it comes down from the brain, but also doing a transverse look at the spinal cord and as well as the spinal nerves that attach. We're going to learn about the meninges in this chapter and then continue discussion of them when we look at the brain. The meninges are membranes that surround and protect the brain and the spinal cord. If you've heard of meningitis, meningitis is when you get inflammation of the meninges. We're going to look at tracts within the spinal cord. So if you remember, a tract is basically a bunch of axons of neurons traveling kind of together. Some of these tracts are ascending, meaning the neurons are heading up to the brain, and then other tracts are descending, so the neurons are sending signals down from the brain. Then we look at the spinal nerves. We look at what's known as roots. That's what attaches the spinal nerves to the spinal cord. We'll also look at a very special ganglia. If you remember, a ganglia is where you have a lot of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. And then the last topic are reflexes. There's a number of interesting reflexes that are controlled by your spinal cord. For example, one such reflex is if you step on, say, a nail, that pain activates a reflex so you can remove your foot quickly from the source of pain. All right, so let's kind of introduce the spinal cord. It extends down from the brain, specifically an area called the brain stem, at about the level of the foramen magnum. So basically you can use that foramen magnum as a divide between the brain above it and the spinal cord below it. Then the spinal cord extends all the way down the vertebral canal and ends at about the L2 vertebra. So it doesn't go all the way down to, say, your sacrum. It ends at about L2. There are 31 segments, all right, so we can kind of divide this spinal cord into 31 parts or segments, and each segment has a pair of spinal nerves. So therefore, there would be 31 pairs of spinal nerves. And you can see these pairs attaching on each side of the spinal cord. These segments we often refer to as cervical. So those would be segments in the neck. Thoracic, those would be segments in the chest area. Lumbar segments in the lower back. There's sacral and coccygeal segments. And therefore, we also use these names to describe the spinal nerves. The spinal cord basically acts as a pathway up to the brain and then down from the brain. So you're going to have tracts in that spinal cord going up or down, carrying information either from the periphery, so that would be sensory, or down from the brain and out to the periphery, that would be motor. When we look at a cross-section, we see very distinct tissue. This outer material is white matter, so that's where you're going to find a lot of myelinated neurons, and that's where you're going to find the tracts going up or down. The gray matter, kind of almost looks like a butterfly here, kind of determines where the signal should go, and we'll talk more about that as we get through this chapter. And then you see these would be the spinal nerves, and then how they attach are by the roots. So this would be what we call a dorsal root because it's towards the back, and this would be the ventral root. All right, a little more anatomy. So we come down from the brain. Here's about where the foramen magnum is. We start to look at the spinal cord, and it looks to be wider here in the neck, and that's known as the cervical enlargement. You'll notice at the bottom of the spinal cord, it's very large as well. That's called the lumbar enlargement. And the reason is you've got a lot of information going in that neck area and in or out of the lumbar region, because that's where most of the neurons are heading in or out that service the arms and that service the legs. So you've got the two enlargements. As we go down, we see the pairs of spinal nerves. Again, 31 pairs of spinal nerves. We see, not very well, but we can see the roots. We'll take a better look at that. The very bottom of the spinal cord, again, that's going to be about at the second lumbar vertebra, comes to a point, and that point is known as the conus medullaris. And then the nerves that kind of extend down from that area is known as the cauda equina, and that means horse's tail. So someone thought that looked or resembled a horse's tail. And then at the very, very end, there's a structure called the filum terminale. That actually attaches to the coccyx and kind of helps to stabilize that very bottom. So that's what we would call a longitudinal look at the spinal cord. This is more of a transverse look, and we want to, spend a lot of time on this image. This is kind of your classic image of the spinal cord, some of the layers that surround the spinal cord. We see a vertebra here. We see a spinal nerve attaching. So there's quite a bit to look at here. And there's a number of ways to do it. You can kind of look at the center, so find the spinal cord first and kind of work your way out, or you could work your way in. It really doesn't matter. If we look at, let's go out or superficial and then move our way deep towards the spinal cord. So we obviously see that this must be bone. So this is one of the vertebrae in the vertebral column. We see that the hole in the center here is going to be the vertebral foramen. We also notice that there's holes here, but remember, this hole is formed in between vertebrae. This hole here is the intervertebral foramen. That's where the spinal nerves are going to be able to come and make contact with the spinal cord. So we've got a spinal nerve here. These are the two roots, all right? One is called the dorsal root because it's towards the back, right? Remember, dorsal also means posterior. So this is the posterior or dorsal root. This is the ventral root. So that's how they attach to the spinal cord. Notice the dorsal root has a ganglion, known as the dorsal root ganglion. And inside that ganglion, there are a lot of cell bodies. And this root, the dorsal root, carries all the sensory neurons. So we'll talk about that more later on, but sensory information comes in the dorsal root. Motor signals that come out are going out the ventral root. And then the roots combine to form the spinal nerve. So therefore, the spinal nerve is what we would call mixed because it has both sensory neurons in it and motor neurons. Okay. What else do we see? Well, let's work our way towards that spinal cord. Once we get through the vertebra, we see a layer of fat. All right, this yellow stuff is all adipose tissue. And that space there that's largely filled with adipose tissue is called the epidural space because it surrounds the next layer, which is called the dura mater. All right, so epidural space, that name might sound familiar. That is where they do an epidural. So they'll inject anesthesia into this space. It diffuses in and blocks transmission up and down the spinal cord. So that's a way to anesthetize different parts of the body. If we move through the epidural space, we come to the first layer of the meninges, and that's called the dura mater. All right, the dura mater is this layer here. You have to look very close so you don't confuse it with the next couple things. It's in contact with the epidural space. That's going to be the toughest layer. All right, so meninges is plural, meninx is singular. So that's going to be the tough outermost meninx. All right, it's made up of dense, irregular connective tissue. All right, if we go through that layer, there's a little bit of a space between it and the next layer of the meninges. So there's what's called the subdural space. And then we hit the middle layer, which is called the arachnoid mater. Arachnoid might sound familiar. Arachnoid pertains to spiders. Someone believed that this layer kind of looked like a spider web because it has kind of web-like collagen fibers. So that's the middle layer. Then there's a pretty big space here, a very important space called the subarachnoid space because it's underneath the arachnoid mater. That's where we're going to find quite a bit of cerebral spinal fluid. Remember, cerebral spinal fluid means cerebral, meaning the brain, so it surrounds your brain, but it also surrounds the spinal cord. All right, so it's found in the subarachnoid space. Okay, so that space is very important. Then if we go through that space, we will finally hit a layer that's physically attached to the spinal cord. That's the pia mater. So we got dura, arachnoid, and pia. And the pia mater is very thin, very delicate. It's the innermost layer of the meninges, and it's physically attached, in this case, to the spinal cord. When we look at the brain, it's going to be attached to the brain. So those are collectively considered your meninges. There's a little extension here off the pia mater called the denticulate ligament. It kind of helps hold that spinal cord in place. We don't necessarily want it, moving around much in that vertebral canal. All right, so quite a bit of an anatomy to go through on that picture. This is a similar one. It doesn't really add more. It's just kind of another view looking at the layers. So again, we're kind of working superficial to deep. This doesn't show the epidural space. It doesn't show all that adipose tissue, but you can see this outer layer is the dura. Then you have the middle layer, which is the arachnoid. Then they show the subarachnoid space in here, and then the pia mater right here. So you see the three layers again. You see the nerve. You can kind of see the neurons in there. And then the two roots, the ventral root and the dorsal root, in this case showing the ganglion. The epineurium is connective tissue. So there's connective tissue that kind of surrounds that spinal cord. All right, so that's epineurium. All right, this is another view. Looks very similar. Kind of gets rid of all the meninges and some of that other tissue. I use this to show more of the internal anatomy of the spinal cord, but you'll notice it still shows the nerve and the roots. So there's white matter. It kind of tends to be found more superficially in the spinal cord. So this is all white matter here. It's divided up into what they call columns. So this would be the posterior column or white column. This is lateral white column. And then this is anterior white column. Again, when we start getting into the tracts within the white matter, there are specific tracts that lead to places. They might lead up to a specific place in the brain, or they might be coming down from a specific part of the brain. The gray matter, we use horns to describe the areas. This is the posterior gray horn, lateral gray horn here, this little bump out there, and then this is the anterior gray horn. And then in the center, there's a central canal. So that's a little canal where you'll also find cerebral spinal fluid. So this again was more to show you the white matter divided into columns and the gray matter divided into horns. How does the spinal cord work? That's going to be the beginning of the next video. So basically this first video is all anatomy, looking at some pictures. The next video we're going to start to look at exactly how does this spinal cord work in the overall function of your nervous system.